A millionaire saves a young boy who collapsed in front of his mansion. A few days later, ambulances and police cars are screaming all over his estate because the iron gates of the Erickson estate groaned open as the first light of dawn spilled over the manicured hedges and glistened off the frost-laden grass. Nathan Erickson, wrapped in a tailored overcoat, stepped out into the biting cold. The crisp morning air stung his face, and each exhale formed with arcs of fog that dissolved as quickly as they appeared. He paused at the top of the marble steps, the silence around him so pristine that it felt almost intrusive. The faint crunch of gravel disrupted his thoughts. Nathan's sharp gaze flickered toward the driveway. Nothing stirred yet. The sound lingered in his mind, distant but insistent, like an echo of something unseen. Then he heard it, a muffled, pitiful whimper, barely audible against the whisper of the wind. He turned toward the noise, scanning the foot of the steps. There, curled up like a discarded rag doll, was a small, frail figure. Nathan descended cautiously, his leather shoes clicking against the cold stone. As he neared, the details emerged. A boy no older than 8 or 9, dressed in tattered clothing that clung pitifully to his skeletal frame. His thin arms were wrapped around himself, trembling against the winter's chill. His head lolled to the side, revealing a pale dirt star, a face half hidden beneath a mop of dark matted hair. Nathan hesitated. His first instinct was to call for security. Strangers didn't simply wander onto his estate, especially not children, but the boy's state gave him pause. One hand clutched a threadbare jacket against his chest, as though it were armor. In the other, he clung to a photograph, creased and worn, of a smiling woman whose face was barely visible under the grime. Nathan crouched, his tailored trousers brushing the cold stone. "Hey," he said, his voice low but firm. "Can you hear me?" The boy didn't respond. His breath came in short, labored gasps that puffed weakly into the frigid air. Nathan extended a hand, but the boy flinched, even unconscious, his body instinctively retreating further into itself. For a moment, Nathan froze. The man who had spent decades mastering negotiations, commanding boardrooms, and navigating labyrinthine deals now found himself uncertain over what to do with a child on his doorstep. His hand hovered before he withdrew it, glancing back toward the house. "Elizabeth," he murmured to himself. The name steadied him, straightening. He slipped his arms beneath the boy's frail frame, his hands pressing against skin so cold it made him wince. The boy's head lolled against Nathan's chest as he lifted him, alarmingly light, like a bundle of dried twigs. Nathan hurried back up the steps, every step heavier with the weight of uncertainty. Inside, the warmth of the grand foyer enveloped him, but it felt somehow hollow against the scene unfolding. The chandelier above cast a golden glow over polished floors and towering pillars, starkly contrasting the boy's disheveled figure in Nathan's arms. Teresa. Nathan's voice echoed through the space, sharp and commanding. A middle-aged woman in a pressed uniform appeared almost instantly, her expression flickering between confusion and alarm. As she took in the scene, "Prepare a guest room," Nathan said briskly, "and bring blankets, hot water." Quickly, Teresa nodded, disappearing down the corridor. From the far side of the room, the hum of wheelchair wheels preceded the arrival of Elizabeth Erickson. Her presence, though subdued, filled the space. Draped in an elegant cashmere shawl, her sharp blue eyes immediately settled on the boy. "Nathan." Her voice was soft, questioning, but not accusatory. Nathan turned, his jaw tightening. "I found him outside," he said simply. Elizabeth rolled closer, her gaze studying the boy's face, lingering on the grime and the fragile clutch of the photograph in his hand. She didn't speak for a moment, her expression unreadable, before she finally murmured, "He looks like he hasn't eaten in days." Nathan's eyes flicked to the photograph, still trapped in the boy's fingers. "And he's alone," he added almost to himself. The boy stirred faintly, his head shifting against Nathan's chest, but his eyes remained closed. Elizabeth's gaze softened. "We should find out what happened to him," she said, her tone laced with quiet insistence. Nathan nodded, though his mind was already spinning. Who was this boy? Why had he ended up here of all places? And what kind of desperation had driven him to collapse on the doorstep of a stranger? As Teresa returned with a bundle of blankets and a young maid trailed behind, Her with steaming towels, Nathan carried the boy toward the staircase. Elizabeth remained in place, watching them ascend. Her fingers tightened on the arms of her wheelchair, a flicker of something unspoken crossing her face. She had always been the observer, the anchor when Nathan charged ahead. But this boy's arrival felt different, like a thread pulled loose from the fabric of their carefully constructed life. The heavy curtains, drawn against the glaring morning sun, dimly lit the room. A faint scent of eucalyptus lingered in the air, mingling with the warmth from the fireplace. Peter stirred beneath a thick quilt, his eyelids fluttering open. His gaze darted wildly around the unfamiliar room. For a moment, the opulence of the dark wood furniture and the chandelier above him a stark contrast to the cold stone walls he was familiar with. He tried to sit up, but his muscles betrayed him, weak from exhaustion. The door creaked open. Peter froze, his small frame tensing as Nathan stepped inside. Nathan paused at the threshold, his silhouette framed by the soft glow of the hallway light. He held a steaming cup of tea in one hand, his expression unreadable but not unkind. "You're awake, Nathan," said his deep voice, filling the room. Peter didn't respond. His dark eyes narrowing with suspicion, he shifted slightly, the quilt slipping down to reveal his thin arms. The boy's hand instinctively reached for the photograph tucked under the covers, clutching it as though it were a lifeline. Nathan set the cup down on the bedside table and pulled a chair closer, its legs scraping softly against the hardwood floor. He sat with a deliberate calm, leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped. "You are safe here," he began, his tone measured. "No one will hurt you." Peter's grip on the photograph tightened, his lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, he stared at Nathan, his expression a mix of fear and defiance. Nathan sighed, running a hand through his black streak hair. "I don't know where you came from," he continued, "but you were freezing on my doorstep if I hadn't brought you inside." He stopped himself, realizing the futility of finishing the sentence. Soft knock broke the silence. Elizabeth's wheelchair appeared in the doorway, and her eyes immediately found Peter. "I thought you might need this," she said, holding up a tray with a bowl of soup and a slice of bread. Her voice was gentle, unassuming, the way one might speak to a cornered animal. Peter's gaze flicked between Nathan and Elizabeth, his body rigid. "Just try a little," Elizabeth urged. "You must be hungry." There was something disarming in her tone, a quiet persistence that softened Peter's scowl. Slowly, he extended a trembling hand toward the tray. Elizabeth wheeled closer, setting it on the small table beside the bed. Careful not to startle him, he took the bread first, tearing off a small piece and chewing cautiously. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly, though his eyes never left Nathan. "What's your name?" Nathan asked after a moment. Peter swallowed, he hesitating before muttering, "Peter." "How old are you?" "Peter, 10 this time," he responded more quickly, even though his voice was barely audible. Elizabeth smiled faintly, her hands resting on the edges of her wheelchair. "10 is a good age," she said. "I bet you're smart." Peter didn't respond, but his expression softened just enough for Nathan to notice. Encouraged, Nathan leaned forward. "Peter, can you tell us where you came from?" he asked, keeping his voice even. "We just want to help." At that, Peter's face darkened. He shoved the photograph deeper under the quilt, his gaze hardening. "I don't need help," he snapped, his small frame shaking. Elizabeth spoke before Nathan could respond. "It's okay," she said gently. "You don't have to tell us anything if you're not ready." The boy's jaw tightened, but he didn't retreat further. Minutes passed in silence, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire. Peter finished the bread and soup in small, deliberate bites, as though rationing each morsel. Finally, he spoke, his voice so low that Nathan had to strain to hear. "I ran away," Peter admitted. From them?" "Who's them?" Nathan asked carefully. Peter hesitated, his eyes darting to the photograph before looking away. "The orphanage," he said at last. They don't care about us, they hurt us, and if you fight back, it gets worse." Elizabeth's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Nathan felt his chest tighten, a cold weight settling there. "How long were you there?" Nathan asked, his tone soft. And now Peter shrugged, his expression guarded. "Since I was little. I don't remember when." "Why did you leave?" The boy's fingers tightened around the quilt, his knuckles white. He whispered, his voice breaking, "No one else would come for me. I Had to run, no one else would come. Nathan sat back, the boy's words cutting deeper than he'd expected. A memory surfaced, unbidden, a young woman storming out of the Erickson estate years ago, her face streaked with tears. He pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on Peter, who now clung to the photograph as though it were the only thing anchoring him to the room. Nathan didn't know why he felt so compelled to help this boy. But as he watched Peter's small frame curl up beneath the quilt, his resolve hardened. For now, he would let the boy rest. Answers could wait. Peter stood in the middle of the vast marble hallway, his bare feet silent against the cold, polished floor. The grand staircase twisted up toward the second level like the spine of a giant, its mahogany rails gleaming under the golden glow of the chandelier. He craned his neck, his eyes wide, taking in the high ceilings painted with intricate fresco of cloud and winged cherubs. He had never seen a place like this. It was as though he had stepped into one of the picture books the older kids at the orphanage hoarded, pages worn thin by tiny, desperate fingers, searching for a glimpse of somewhere better. Careful with the vase, Nathan's voice called gently from behind. Peter, startled, spinning around, his gaze darted toward a tall porcelain standing precariously close to where he had stepped. He shuffled back, his ears burning with embarrassment. Nathan stood at the far end of the hall, leaning against the edge of a doorframe. He was dressed casually, his tie missing, and his shirt sleeves rolled up to the elbows, an unusual look for a man who seemed to wear authority as naturally as his tailored suits. You don't have to be so tense, Nathan said, with a faint smile. We can easily lose ourselves in this house. Peter didn't respond, his hands balling into fists at his sides. He looked back toward the vase, his shoulders tightening. It's just an old pot, Nathan said, stepping closer. If it breaks, it breaks. Nothing here is more important than you. Peter's eyes flickered up at him, the words striking him as strange. At the orphanage, everything was more important than him. The fern, the rules, and even the silence held greater significance than him. Nathan crouched slightly, his gaze leveling with Peter. You're free to explore the surroundings, he said. Touch things if you want. The house won't crumble, I promise. For a moment, Peter didn't move. Then, cautiously, he nodded. Nathan gave him a small pat on the shoulder before straightening and stepping back, giving the boy space. Elizabeth sat in the sunroom, a large canvas spread out before her on the small oak table. Bright tubes of paint cluttered the surface, their caps loose, tiny smudges of color marking her fingers. She angled her wheelchair slightly toward the windows, allowing sunlight to pour in and cast a soft glow on her pale face. She glanced up as Peter hesitated in the doorway. Come in, she said, her tone warm but casual. I could use an extra pair of hands. Peter lingered on the threshold, his small frame stiff with hesitation. His gaze shifted to the canvas, then to her face. It's just a project, Elizabeth continued. We need to find a way to make this room feel a bit less empty. Her lips twitched in a small smile. I was thinking of painting a garden, flowers, maybe. What do you think? Peter shuffled closer, his steps slow and deliberate. He stood across from her, his hands tucked into the oversized sweater Nathan had found for him. I don't know much about flowers, he admitted softly. That's fine, Elizabeth said, pushing a paintbrush across the table toward him. Neither do I. We can make them up. For a long moment, Peter stared at the paintbrush. His fingers twitched at his sides. He gently picked it up, treating it like a fragile object. Elizabeth watched him carefully, her smile widening just slightly. Pick a color, she encouraged. Peter's dark eyes scanned the tubes of paint, his brows furrowing in concentration. Finally, he reached for a small tube of green, squeezing a dollop onto the edge of the palette. The color bloomed like a tiny leaf on the surface. He hesitated again before dipping the brush into the paint and dragging it across the canvas. The line was uneven, the green smudging slightly, but it was deliberate. Peter drew back, looking at the mark as though it was something alien. It's a terrific start, Elizabeth said, her voice steady. Keep going. That evening, Nathan sat alone in his study, a thick folder open on the desk in front of him. Sealed and signatures marked the papers within, while legal jargon filled the margins. He flipped through them slowly, his fingers brushing against the edges as though they might crumble under his touch. He glanced toward the closed door, His thoughts wandering to the boy asleep in one of the guest rooms. The decision he was making felt impulsive, reckless even. But every time he considered sending Peter back to the place that had driven him to flee, something inside him rebelled. He couldn't do it. The thought of Peter standing in that cold hallway, staring at the porcelain vase, as though his very existence threatened it, filled Nathan with a deep, unfamiliar ache. This house, this life, it was more than big enough for one more. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the decision settling in his chest. "You will never go back," he murmured under his breath, the words firm but quiet. Somewhere in the house, the soft sound of laughter carried through the halls. Peter's voice, light and hesitant, mingled with Elizabeth's, forming a fragile but unmistakable bond. Nathan smiled faintly, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time in years. The house didn't feel so empty. 3 months had passed since Peter's arrival, and the Erickson estate had settled into a gentle rhythm. Mornings were filled with quiet breakfasts by the sunlit windows, Elizabeth encouraging Peter to try new foods while Nathan read the financial news. Afternoon saw Peter roaming the house, marveling at its labyrinthine corridors and hidden alcoves, often accompanied by Elizabeth as they worked on their now vibrant mural in the sun room. Nathan spent the evenings in the library, introducing Peter to the world of books and igniting a curiosity in the boy that even he hadn't anticipated. But on an overcast afternoon, when the clouds hung low and the air was thick with the promise of rain, the rhythm shattered. The doorbell echoed through the house. Teresa, the housekeeper, hurried past the sitting room, her shoes clicking against the marble floor. Peter, perched on the edge of a chair near the fireplace, looked up from the book he was struggling to read. Nathan, seated across from him with a stack of business documents, raised a brow. "Are you expecting someone?" he inquired. Peter shook his head, clutching the book tighter. A moment later, Teresa reappeared, her expression uncertain. "Sir, there's a woman at the door. She says her name is Cheryl Erickson." Nathan's face stilled, his usual composure faltering for a fraction of a second. The name hung in the air like an unspoken secret, thick with history. He stood, his movements measured but tense, and strode toward the foyer. Peter watched him leave, his stomach tightening with unease. Peter wasn't accustomed to receiving guests, particularly those who made Nathan appear that way. Nathan reached the door, his hand pausing on the brass handle. He took a steady breath before pulling it open. Standing on the threshold was Cheryl, her figure dwarfed by the grandeur of the entrance. Her clothes were clean but modest, her coat slightly too thin for the season. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a stack of papers, her eyes searching Nathan's face with a mix of nervousness and music. "Defiance, Cheryl," Nathan said, his voice low but firm. "It's been a long time." She nodded, her lips pressing together as if to hold back a flood of words. "I didn't know where else to go," she said finally. "But I think you have someone here who belongs to me." Nathan's brows furrowed. "What are you talking about?" She extended the stack of papers toward him. "I've been looking for him for months. The adoption agency said he was here." "Peter, he's my son." The words struck Nathan with a chilling force. His grip on the door tightened as his gaze flicked to the papers. The name Peter Erickson appeared on birth certificates, legal documents, and photographs. "Come inside," he said, his tone clipped. In the sitting room, Peter's head snapped up when Cheryl entered. His eyes darted to Nathan, then to the woman trailing behind him. There was something familiar in the sharpness of her cheekbones and the way her dark hair framed her face. He shifted uncomfortably as Nathan motioned for Cheryl to sit. "I owe you an explanation," Cheryl began, her voice steady but tinged with regret. "I left home years ago, Nathan. You know why? I thought I was in love, and I thought I could build a life of my own. But Mark, he wasn't the man I thought he was." Peter's eyes narrowed at the mention of a name he didn't recognize. Cheryl continued, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "When I told him I was pregnant, he disappeared. He vanished without warning. I was alone, broke, and too ashamed to come back to the family I'd abandoned, so I did what I thought was best. I put Peter in an orphanage. I told myself I'd come back for him when I could." Nathan's jaw tightened, his gaze fixed on his sister. "And yet it took you 10 years. I tried." Cherry's voice broke, raw and defensive. "I returned only to find him gone. They told Me, he'd run away. I've been looking ever since. Her words lingered in the atmosphere, dense and weighty. Peter, who had been silent, suddenly stood, his face contorted with anger. You left me there, he said, his voice trembling but loud. You just left me. Cheryl turned to him, her eyes filling with tears. Peter, I know, he shouted, his fists clenched at his sides. You didn't come back. You didn't care. You simply abandoned me just like everyone else. Peter, please, Cheryl pleaded, her voice breaking. It wasn't like that. Peter shook his head violently, backing toward the door. I don't want to hear it. I don't care. Before anyone could stop him, he bolted from the room, his footsteps echoing down the hall. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Cheryl buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Nathan, torn between the raw grief of his sister and the boy he had come to care for, stood rooted in place. You should have come sooner, he said finally, his voice hard. He's not the same boy you left behind, Cheryl. He's been through things you can't imagine. I know, she whispered, her voice muffled. But I want to make it right. I'll do whatever it takes. Nathan exhaled heavily, running a hand through his hair. That's not up to me, it's up to him. In the distance, the faint sound of a door slamming echoed through the halls. Peter's absence was palpable, a storm brewing beneath the surface of the Erickson estate. The storm brewing in the Erickson estate grew fiercer with each passing day. Peter avoided Cheryl as though her very presence was poison. If she entered a room, he would find an excuse to leave. His laughter, which had begun to echo through the halls during his early months with Nathan and Elizabeth, now faded into silence. Nathan found himself caught in the middle, trying to maintain the fragile balance of their fractured household. He frequently observed Peter from a distance, observing his tightly clenched fists and the way he clenched his teeth whenever Cheryl's voice floated through the hallways. It was the same anger Nathan had felt decades ago, though he had buried it deep. Nathan stood in his study one evening, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring out the rain-speckled window. The dim glow of the desk lamp cast long shadows across the room. He could almost hear his father's booming voice echoing through his memory. She's a disgrace to this family, his father had thundered, pacing the length of the drawing room at the age of 25. Having recently graduated from business school, Nathan watched helplessly as his sister, who was barely 19, stood defiantly before their parents. You don't understand, Cheryl had cried, her voice shaking but determined. I love him. Mark isn't. Mark is a nobody, their mother had interjected, her sharp tone cutting through the air like a whip. You're throwing your future away for a man who will ruin you. Nathan remained silent, steadfast in his position. He'd wanted to defend her, to speak out against their parents' rigid expectations, but the weight of his own fear had kept him quiet. He could still see the look on Cheryl's face as she stormed out that night, her suitcase in one hand and her dignity clutched tightly in the other. Nathan's grip tightened around the glass. He had let her go, then convincing himself that she would come back and that she would see reason, but she hadn't. And now, years later, the consequences of that night had returned in the form of a broken boy and a sister desperate for redemption. Cheryl wasn't faring any better. She dedicated her days to exploring ways to establish a connection with Peter, only to encounter his icy indifference. She left small gifts on his bedside table, an old book she thought he might like, a sketch pad, even his favorite snacks, but they remained untouched. One afternoon, she found Peter in the sunroom where Elizabeth sat painting. Perched on a stool, Peter meticulously applied paint onto the canvas using slow, deliberate strokes. He didn't look up as Cheryl entered, but she saw the way his shoulders tensed. That's beautiful, Cheryl said softly, stepping closer. Peter's brush paused mid-stroke. Go away, he muttered, his voice low. Elizabeth glanced between them, her expression cautious. Peter, maybe I said go away, Peter shouted, throwing the brush down. He turned to Cheryl, his dark eyes blazing. You don't get to come in here and act like you cared. You left me. You didn't come back. Are you now attempting to impersonate my mother? Cheryl flinched as though he had struck her. I'm trying, Peter, she said, her voice trembling. I know I hurt you. I know I failed, but I'm here now and I don't care what you want, Peter yelled, jumping off the stool. You're not my family. You never were. He stormed out of the room, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Elizabeth reached for Cheryl's hand As she sank into a nearby chair, her face buried in her hands that night, Nathan found Cheryl sitting alone in the library, her face pale and drawn. She clutched the photograph Peter had kept so tightly during those first days, the edges worn. "And afraid he's not ready," Nathan said as he stepped into the room. Cheryl looked up, her eyes red. "He hates me, he's angry," Nathan corrected, sitting across from her. "Hume's been frustrated for a long time. He is angry at the orphanage, at the world, and at you. It's going to take time." Cheryl stared at the photograph, her thumb brushing over the image. "I never wanted this for him. I thought I was doing the right thing. I believed that he would benefit more from my absence." Nathan's expression softened. "And yet here we are." She gave a bitter laugh. "I don't deserve his forgiveness, do I?" Nathan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "It's not about deserving, Cheryl. It's about earning it." His words lingered in the air, laden with truth. Cheryl nodded, slowly gripping the photograph tighter. Meanwhile, Peter sat curled up in a corner of his room, the door firmly shut. He clutched one of Nathan's books, but the words blurred before his eyes. He thought of Cheryl's face and the way her voice cracked when she spoke to him. A part of him wanted to believe her, to let go of the anger burning in his chest, but the scars ran too deep. "No one comes back," he whispered to himself, the words like a mantra. "No one." The rain continued to pound against the windows, drowning out the quiet sobs that filled the Erickson estate. The following morning was still, the air inside the Erickson estate heavy with unspoken words. Cheryl, seated at the large kitchen table, traced her fingers along the smooth edge of a porcelain plate. The aroma of fresh bread and eggs filled the air, yet she hadn't touched her plate. Instead, her gaze drifted toward the corridor where she knew Peter had locked himself in his room again. Determined to try something different, she stood abruptly. Teresa, the housekeeper, glanced up in surprise as Cheryl walked to the stove. "I'll handle breakfast for Peter today," Cheryl said softly. Cheryl cooked with a deliberation that was almost reverent, the soft hiss of eggs frying in butter, the rhythmic slicing of fruit, and the quiet clink of plates grounded her. She remembered the meals she used to prepare when Peter was just a baby, the way his tiny hands reached for the spoon she held when the tray was ready, a plate of warm toast, eggs, and a small glass of orange juice. She carried it upstairs, her hands trembling slightly. Standing outside Peter's door, she hesitated, then knocked gently. "No response, Peter," she said, her voice steady but quiet. "I made you breakfast. It's your favorite scrambled eggs, just the way you like them." The silence on the other side of the door was deafening. She sighed and placed the tray on the floor before retreating down the hallway behind her. The door cracked open just a sliver, a small hand darting out to retrieve the tray before it closed again. It wasn't much, but it was something. Later that day, Cheryl found herself in the sunroom with Elizabeth. They worked side by side on the mural, Elizabeth's brush moving in fluid strokes, while Cheryl's movements were more hesitant. "Don't overthink it," Elizabeth said gently, noticing Cherry's hesitation. "The paint isn't going to judge you." Cheryl smiled faintly, dipping her brush into a soft pink hue. "It's been years since I painted anything." "You're doing fine," Elizabeth replied. After a pause, she added, "Peter isn't as hard as he seems. You know, he's just guarding himself." Cheryl set her brush down and sighed. "I want to reach him, Elizabeth, but every time I try, it's like he builds another wall. Walls can come down," Elizabeth said simply, her tone calm but firm. "But you have to keep chipping away. Give him something real." The breakthrough came that evening unexpectedly. Peter had left his door slightly open, allowing Cheryl to discern the faint glow of his bedside lamp. Gathering her courage, she stepped inside. Peter was sitting cross-legged on his bed, the tattered photograph of Cheryl in his hands. He didn't look up as she entered, but he didn't tell her to leave either. "I remember that day," Cheryl said softly, nodding toward the photograph. "Your aunt took that picture." I was smiling because I had just found out I was pregnant with you. Peter's fingers tightened around the photo. "Why do you still care about it?" he muttered, his voice bitter. "You left me, you gave me away." Cheryl sat on the edge of the bed, leaving space between them. "I've carried that memory with me every day," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "It was the only thing that kept me going when I had nothing else. I thought I was giving you a chance at a better life. I was wrong, Peter. I see that now." Peter turned the photo over in his hands, his anger flickering like a candle in the wind they tore it, he said finally. His voice low. The incident occurred at the orphanage, they laughed, and said it didn't matter. Cheryl's heart broke at his words. It does matter, she said firmly. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small envelope. Here, Peter hesitated before taking it. Inside was the same photograph, meticulously restored, the creases and tears smoothed away. His breath caught as he stared at it, the familiar image now whole again. I wanted you to have it, Cheryl said, not just the memory, but something real, something that lasts. For the first time, Peter looked up at her, his dark eyes searching her face. There was no forgiveness yet, but there was something softer, something less guarded. He clutched the photo to his chest. Small but telling gesture. That night, Peter sat with Elizabeth in the sunroom, his voice barely above a whisper. As he began to speak, he talked about the orphanage, the night spent hungry, the punishments for the smallest infractions, the way the other children avoided making connections because it hurt too much when someone left. Elizabeth listened intently, her hand resting lightly on his arm. You've carried so much on your own, she said softly. You don't have to anymore. Peter glanced at Cheryl, who stood quietly in the doorway watching, but not intruding. For the first time, he didn't flinch at her presence. Instead, he held up the restored photograph, his voice hesitant but clear. Did you really keep this for me? Cheryl stepped forward, her own voice trembling. Every single day. Peter nodded slowly, as though processing her words. He didn't say anything more, but the small, almost imperceptible smile on his face was enough. The Erickson estate was quiet, basking in the soft glow of a pale afternoon sun. For the first time in weeks, the tension between Cheryl and Peter seemed to have thawed, leaving room for tentative steps toward healing. We can absolutely mend important relationships if we make effort, right? Have you ever regretted a relationship that has broken down in the past? If so, leave a comment. Green tea, so we have a chance to send you a word of comfort. Now, let's continue. Elizabeth sat in the sun room with Peter, their conversation punctuated by the occasional laughter that felt like a BL to the heavy atmosphere. Nathan was in his study sorting through documents when Teresa's hurried footsteps echoed down the corridor. Her voice trembled as she knocked on the door. Sir, she said, her eyes wide with unease. There's a man at the gates. He's demanding to see Cheryl and Peter. Nathan frowned, standing immediately. Who is he? Teresa hesitated, wiping her hands. He says his name is Mark. The name was a cold shock dragging Nathan back to memories he had long tried to bury. Without a word, he brushed past Teresa and made his way toward the entrance. His polished shoes clicked sharply against the marble floors, each step laced with mounting anger. Mark stood at the front gates, his posture casual yet exuding a sinister arrogance. He was tall, his hair neatly combed, dressed in a leather jacket that seemed deliberately chosen to project an air of authority. His eyes scanned the estate with a calculating glint, pausing on the grand facade of the mansion. When Nathan appeared, Mark smirked. Nathan Erickson, he drawled, his voice smooth and edged with mockery. It's been a while. Nathan's expression was cold, his jaw tight. What are you doing here? I've come to see my son, Mark said, as though the statement were entirely reasonable. And Cheryl, we have unfinished business. Nathan stepped closer to the gate, his presence towering. You have no business here. Cheryl doesn't want to see you, and Peter doesn't know you. Leave. Mark's smirk widened. You think you can play the hero? Keep them tucked away in your ivory tower while you write me out of the story. Leaning closer, he gripped the iron bars of the gate. Cheryl was mine first, Nathan. She came to me because she believed in me, and Peter is my blood. You can't erase that. Nathan's voice dropped cold and sharp. You abandoned them. You had your chance and you walked away. Mark's expression hardened, his tone shifting to a dangerous whisper. And whose fault was that? Your family made sure I'd never be enough for her. You poisoned her against me. You did that yourself. Nathan shot back. Cheryl trusted you, and you destroyed her life. The tension between the two men crackled with the intensity of a live wire. Mark's hand tightened on the gate, his knuckles white. This isn't over, he said, his voice low and threatening. I'll be back, and when I am, you won't be able to keep me from what's mine. Inside the house, Cheryl stood in the shadows of the corridor, her face pale as she listened to the muffled argue. Outside, she had recognized Mark's voice, The moment it pierced the quiet of the estate, her heart raced, torn between fear and anger. Peter appeared at the other end of the hall, his steps hesitant. "Who's yelling?" he asked, his voice uncertain. Cheryl froze. How could she explain this to him? How could she prepare him for the man waiting outside? Before she could respond, Nathan entered, his face stormy. "It's Mark," he said, his eyes flicking to Cheryl. "He's currently away, but he will return." Peter brow furrowed. "Mark? Who's Mark?" Cheryl swallowed deeply, her voice barely audible over a whisper. "He's your father." Peter blinked, the words landing like a physical blow. "My father?" His voice wavered between disbelief and anger. Cheryl nodded, her eyes glistening. "Yes, he's the man I told you about, the one who left before you were born." Peter stepped back, his expression a mix of confusion and betrayal. "You never told me he'd come back." "You didn't." He broke off, his hands curling into fists. "Why is he here now? Why does he care now?" Nathan stepped forward, his tone firm but calm. "He intends to control you, Peter. That's what Mark does. He takes what he wants without caring who he hurts." Peter's gaze darted between Cheryl and Nathan, his mind racing. "But he's still my dad, isn't he?" Cheryl flinched, her voice breaking. "Biologically, yes, but being a father is more than just blood, Peter. He's never been there for you. He doesn't know you." Peter's shoulders slumped, his voice a mere murmur. "And you left me too." The words lingered in the atmosphere, piercing through any disagreement. Cheryl's tears spilled over as she stepped closer to him. "I know," she said. "I know I failed you, but I'm here now, and I'll fight for you no matter what." Peter didn't respond. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the hall. That night the house felt heavier than it had in weeks. Nathan sat with Cheryl in the study, both of them silent as the storm outside raged. "He won't stop," Cheryl said finally, her voice trembling. "Mark Hek, not the type to give up." Nathan nodded, his expression grim. "Let him come. He won't get near you or Peter, not while I'm here." The Erikin estate prepared for the impending storm as thunder rolled in the distance. The first sign that Mark hadn't left for good was the shadow moving across the Erickson estate's perimeter. That night Nathan noticed it from his study window, a dark silhouette slipping through the trees lining the back gardens. He sat down, his whiskey glass, heart pounding with a mix of dread and fury. Mark had returned just as he promised. Nathan moved swiftly, locking the doors and instructing Teresa to ensure the household staff stayed inside. He didn't want panic to ripple through the estate, but he wasn't taking chances. The storm raging outside mirrored the one brewing inside him. Rain pounded against the windows, lightning illuminating the estate in brief, jagged flashes. In Peter's room, the boy sat at his desk, staring at the restored photograph of Cheryl. The muffled sound of thunder made the glass of water on his table tremble. He glanced at the door, his nerves on edge, though he wasn't sure why. A noise, a faint tapping, as though something hard struck the glass of his balcony doors, made him freeze. Slowly Peter turned to look. A figure stood just beyond the rain-struck glass. He couldn't see the man's face, but the silhouette was unmistakable. Peter's heart raced as the man gestured for him to open the door. Mark. Cheryl was in the sunroom with Elizabeth, her hands trembling as she struggled to paint. Her brush hovered over the canvas, the vibrant colors she had been working on earlier now seeming meaningless. The sense of surveillance and pursuit persisted in her. "Cheryl," Elizabeth said softly, her calm voice breaking through the tension. "You're safe here." Cheryl put the brush down, her face pale. He'll come back. I know him. Mark doesn't give up when he wants something." A sharp noise, a crash of glass, cut through the house, shattering the quiet. Elizabeth immediately wheeled herself toward the door. "Stay here," she instructed, but Cheryl was already on her feet, heading for the source. Nathan reached Peter's room just as Mark stepped inside through the shattered balcony door. Rainwater pulled on the carpet as Mark loomed over for Peter, his hand extended. "Come on, Peter," Mark said, his voice deceptively soft. "We're leaving." Peter pressed himself against the wall, his voice shaking. "I don't want to go." Mark's expression darkened, the charm slipping away to reveal the predator beneath. "I didn't come all this way for a no," he snapped, grabbing Peter's arm. "Let him go." Nathan's voice pierced the room with a sharp edge. He stood in the doorway, his fists clenched, his presence commanding. Mark sneered, "Stay out of this, Nathan. He's my son. You're nothing to him."